You're standing on sand, so hot, it blisters your feet in seconds. The air is 110 degrees. Your body is losing 1.5 liters of water every single hour, just trying to cool itself down, and you have nothing to drink. The math doesn't care about your willpower. Lose 2% of your body water and your thinking starts to go. Lose 5% and your muscles lock up. You can't tell north from south. Lose 10% and your heart quits. Most people are dead within 24 hours. Almost nobody survives past 36. This is the empty quarter, the largest continuous sand desert on Earth. For thousands of years, Bedouin nomads didn't just pass through it. They lived here, raised families here, crossed hundreds of miles of the same killing ground, season after season, with no map, no instruments, and no rescue coming. They weren't lucky. They weren't physically different from anyone else. They had built a complete survival system, one that didn't fight the desert at all, one that used it. This is how they did it. Chapter 1. Reading the Desert. Bedouins could find water where outsiders saw nothing. No plants, no rivers, no visible wells. Sometimes they found it with nothing more than a single stone. Here's how it worked. In the deep desert of Oman and Yemen, a Bedouin traveler would pick up a heavy stone, drop it flat onto the sand, and listen. Not for water. Water doesn't make noise underground. They were listening to the echo, the way the impact traveled through the layers below and came back up. Dry, solid ground makes a flat, dead thud. But sand sitting on top of a water-saturated layer sounds different, a little hollow, a little resonant, like the ground has something beneath it. Experienced Bedouins could hear the difference between dead rock-bottom silence and the faint echo of a water table within reach. Drop the stone in the wrong spot, and you've wasted energy and water you can't replace. Drop it in the right spot, and you've just bought another week of life. If the echo was right, they dug. Steel shovels were too heavy for long desert crossings, so they used their wooden milk bowls as shovels, the same bowls they ate and drank from. They went down to about the height of a man, drew water up in small goatskin buckets, then covered the whole hole with brushwood and sand. Not to hide it, to protect it. No sun meant no evaporation. No evaporation meant the water below stayed stable for whoever came through next. These temporary wells were called mahsat. The ability to read that echo, to know which sound meant dig and which meant move on, was the difference between crossing alive and dying 2 miles from water you never found. But finding water underground was only the beginning. They also had to know where water might be waiting further ahead. Bedouins tracked using a forensic system called qanat. From a single set of camel prints, they could read an entire situation. The depth of a hoof print told you the animal's weight. A deep, wide print meant a loaded camel, one carrying full water skins, one that had recently resupplied. A shallow print meant an empty animal, likely far from a source. The direction of movement told you if a human was nearby. A camel being led walks a straight line and grazes only what is directly in front of it. A loose camel zigzags from bush to bush with no logic at all. One glance told you whether people were close or you were alone in open rangeland. Even the dung gave up information. Traces of cultivated grain meant the camel had been hand-fed near a settlement. Water infrastructure was close. Only wild desert scrub in the droppings? Long road ahead. Miss these signals and you could walk confidently toward empty sand while water was an hour behind you. The same forensic logic appeared independently among the sand bushmen of the Kalahari. Different desert, different continent, different language, same system. When survival pressure is high enough, human intelligence tends to arrive at the same place. For traveling at night, the Bedouins used the stars, not just as a compass, but as a calendar. Stars rise 4 minutes earlier every evening, and that slow daily shift tracked the seasons across a full year. It told them when the date harvest was approaching at the oasis, when to break camp, when to hold position. When monsoon clouds blocked everything for weeks, they used other signals: the direction sun-tracking flowers faced, the sound of specific beetles, natural clocks that ran on biology instead of mechanics, pattern recognition built across generations and passed down like a craft, finding water, reading tracks, navigating by starlight. Each skill bought them more distance and more time. But there was a hard limit to how far a human body could go on its own in that kind of heat. The Bedouins had found a way around that limit too, and it was alive. Chapter 2. The Animal That Changed Everything. Remove the camel from Arabia and Bedouin civilization disappears almost overnight. Not because the camel was useful transport, because it was biologically irreplaceable. The human body can lose about 12% of its total water weight before the blood thickens past the point where the heart can move it properly. At that stage, core temperature spikes and circulation collapses. That is not a line toughness or training can move. It is physics. A dromedary camel can lose 30 to 40% and keep walking. That is not a modest biological advantage. That is a completely different architecture, built across millions of years in exactly this kind of landscape. Here is the key. When a camel dehydrates, its blood stays fluid. The water loss comes from the tissue spaces and from a large internal fluid reserve, not from the bloodstream. Circulation stays intact. The heart keeps working. The animal keeps moving through conditions that would have already killed a human several times over. Temperature is the next piece. In the desert, fighting to hold a constant internal temperature burns water at a dangerous rate. The camel does not fight it. Its body temperature drops to around 34 degrees at dawn and climbs to 42 degrees at the peak of the afternoon. It stores that heat like a battery through the day. At night, when the desert cools, it releases all of it back into the air without spending a single drop of water. That one adaptation saves up to 5 liters per day. And then there is rehydration. When a severely dehydrated camel finally reaches water, it can drink 110 liters in 10 minutes. In any other animal, that would be lethal. Water flooding into the bloodstream that fast causes the red blood cells to swell and burst. The camel's red blood cells are oval, not round. Their walls can stretch to 240% of their original size without rupturing. A human red blood cell bursts at around 150%. The camel's cells absorb the flood and survive completely intact. Even breathing conserves water. The camel's nasal passages work like a condenser. Dry air comes in, gets humidified. Warm, wet air exits, but on the way out, it passes back over the now cooled nasal surfaces. The moisture condenses and gets pulled back into the body before the breath ever leaves. When the camel is dehydrated, it can exhale at 75% humidity instead of 100%. Respiratory water loss drops by up to 60%. The hump stores fat, not water. That is the most common myth about camels. Up to 45 kilograms of dense fat. Burning that fat does release some water chemically, but the extra breathing required uses more water than it generates. The hump is an energy reserve. By concentrating all that fat in one location, the camel avoids insulating its whole body and can shed heat freely through its legs and underbelly. The Bedouins understood all of this in operational terms. They knew how far a camel could be pushed before it needed rest. They could read its condition from the shape of the hump, the quality of its gait, the look of its eyes. A Bedouin who misjudged his camel's limits in the middle of the empty quarter was not just losing an animal, he was losing everything. Because the camel did something nothing else could replicate. It grazed on dry, thorny scrub that a human could not digest. It tolerated bitter, mineral-heavy well water that would make a person sick within hours. And it converted all of that into something the Bedouins needed more than almost anything else. Milk. 87% water. Rich in fat, protein, and electrolytes. A living biological processor that turned inedible desert vegetation into drinkable nutrition. A walking water source that refilled itself every day. The Bedouins did not just ride the camel. They plugged their own survival into its biology. But even with the camel, water was precious. Every drop had to work harder than a single drop of water should have to work. That demanded a discipline most people have never had to practice. Chapter 3. Making every drop last. Wilfred Thesiger crossed the empty quarter in the late 1940s and wrote down what Bedouin water discipline actually felt like from the inside of it. You traveled at dawn. You traveled at night. At midday, you stopped and sheltered. Not because it was comfortable to stop, but because walking through peak heat burned through your water faster than anything else. Your body's cooling system runs on sweat, and every degree of air temperature above your skin temperature adds to the cost. There was one rule that overrode everything else. No drinking during the day. Not one sip. Drinking in high heat triggers sweating, and in those conditions, you sweat out more water than you took in with the drink. So you marched dry, all day, in 110-degree heat. At sunset, when the air finally cooled and your body could actually hold on to what it received, you got 1 pint. 1 pint. For a full day of marching in 110-degree heat. They did not drink it straight. They mixed it with a small amount of sour camel or goat milk to make a drink called qanat. And this single detail reveals how the whole system was designed. Desert well water carries high mineral content, salt, calcium, heavy compounds. Drink that water alone and your body works to balance the mineral load by flushing fluid out. You end up more dehydrated than before. The sour milk added sodium, potassium, and calcium in proportions the body could absorb, helping cells hold on to water instead of dumping it. The milk also masked the bitter, mineral taste that well water pulled through deep limestone leaves behind. It made a pint of difficult water possible to actually drink without fighting your own instincts. Milk poured into the leather container also sealed small pores in the hide over time, reducing leakage across long crossings. And then something strange happened. Because the camel swayed continuously through every hour of walking, the fat in the qanat mixture churned slowly inside the container. After about a week of marching, the water skin started making butter by itself, a small knob of fat sitting at the bottom of the skin. Nobody planned that. It was just what the physics of the march produced when the system ran long enough. The container itself, the girba, was its own piece of engineering. A whole goat hide, cured in a bath of boiled acacia bark. The tannins preserved the leather and kept it flexible, but the curing process did not seal the hide. The porosity was the entire point. Girba held 18 to 27 liters. Because the leather had microscopic pores, a small steady amount of water seeped through to the outer surface at all times. When hot, dry wind hit that moisture, it evaporated. Evaporation is a phase change. Phase changes absorb heat. The heat was pulled out of the container and carried away in the vapor. The water inside stayed cool enough to drink without accelerating the dehydration it was meant to prevent. A clay pot weighed too much and shattered on camelback. A fully sealed container would let the water heat up to match the surrounding air. Drinking near boiling water in extreme heat makes dehydration worse, not better. The slight constant leak of the girba was not a defect. It was the design. Scattered across the harder terrain, children foraged for a small plant called tamer. It grew in stony ground on almost no annual rainfall and produced small tubers just below the surface, each one carrying 90% water. Sweet, raw, edible, straight from the ground. Another water source hidden inside the landscape, visible only to people who knew exactly what to look for. Every piece of the system connected to the next. The camel turned scrub into milk. The milk made dangerous water safe to drink and kept the girba sealed. The girba used evaporation to stay cool. The tracking system turned camel prints into a route. The dropped stone turned into a decision about where to dig. Nothing in this system fought the desert. Every piece of it ran on the desert. Settled civilizations in the same part of the world built their answer in stone. The Persians engineered vast underground aqueducts called qanats, tunneling water from mountain aquifers across hundreds of kilometers to cities in the plains. Iran still has around 36,000 of them, some supplying the same towns they were built for, over 2,700 years ago. The Omanis built a similar system called the aflaj, gravity-fed tunnels from mountain springs to agricultural land, some still running today. Both solve the same problem: how to bring water to a place that does not have any. One answer was carved permanently into bedrock. The other fit entirely onto the back of a camel. The Bedouins did not avoid permanent infrastructure because they could not build it. They avoided it because permanence was a liability in their world. A fixed structure meant a fixed location. A fixed location meant vulnerability to drought in that specific region, to a season where the rain did not fall where you were. Everything the Bedouins built was portable, reversible, and light enough to carry. When the pasture ran dry, they moved. When drought hit, they followed the rain. Their infrastructure lived inside the animals, inside the learned behavior, inside the knowledge passed from parent to child. What they understood, and what most of the modern world has never had to learn, is that surviving a hostile environment does not come from overpowering it. It comes from learning its rules well enough to use them. The desert evaporates water, so they built a container that used evaporation to cool itself. The desert makes camels thirsty, so they let the camel store the heat rather than sweat it out. The desert is dark at night and lethal at noon, so they rested at noon and read the stars in the dark. Every solution used the problem as its power source. That is what the Bedouins understood. Not that the desert could be conquered, that it did not need to be.